I'm going to give you a process, and it's a little different, but hopefully you'll go away from here with some idea of how to attack upgrading an Ext JS 4 application to 6. And I think if you follow the steps I'm going to outline, you have a good chance of doing an upgrade successfully. It's not easy. It's a lot of work, but it can be done. How many people have been told that if you're upgrading from 4 to 6, you really need to rewrite the application? Anybody? Okay. I don't think that's correct, and I'm going to show you why. Before we start out, let's talk about what type of upgrade we want to do, because I've been out in the field. I work for the services group at Sencha, so I get to see a lot of applications, and I've done several upgrades. I've built new applications for clients. So I'm out in the field just like you, building applications. And I've seen some upgrades that are, let's get the code to run in the latest version regardless of how it's put together. So we'll just bring in the latest framework and make it go. And that's what I like to refer as a minimalist upgrade. And we're not really going to deal with that today because I don't think that's really doing an upgrade. What we're going to deal with today is doing a migration. And largely what this involves is using Sencha command to build a new application and then moving the bits and pieces that make up your existing application into that new application and reorganizing it so that it fits the paradigm of Ext JS 6. So how do we want to perform this upgrade? We need to review the architecture of our application. We have to analyze the code. And then we really need to decompose it into its constituent parts. And then we take those parts and put them back together in a form that will work with the latest version of the framework. Now I want to propose a question here. Can anybody tell me that there's an engineering process that just about every child learns, maybe by age 10? Does anybody know what that might be? No? Putting together a jigsaw puzzle. Now, how do we do that? Do we start at the middle with random pieces and put them together and see if we can get the thing built by putting the pieces together as we assemble it? No. We lay out the pieces, and this is a well-defined process that every child who's ever built a jigsaw puzzle knows. You lay out the pieces. The first thing you do is find the corners. Then you assemble the edges, and then you work toward the middle. That allows you to complete the puzzle. Now, what I'm proposing here is that upgrading an Ext JS 4 application to Ext JS 6 is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. So let's go through the steps that we would do to put together our application to perform the upgrade. The first thing we want to do is we want to see if we can find the original requirements. That's going to give us some idea of what the application was supposed to do in the first place. You may or may not have been one of the original developers on that application. So finding that information may be beneficial in upgrading the application. We're going to tear the application apart and put it back together. So we need to know what it was supposed to do in the first place. Now we can run the original application and see that for ourselves, but having that documentation is going to be beneficial. The other thing we need to do is we need to look at the heritage of the application. Where did it start? Was it an Ext JS 1 application that was upgraded to 2, 3, and then to 4? Or did it start out in 4 as a properly put together Sencha MVC application? And that's important because if we've got existing legacy code, that's going to make our process to upgrade the application a little more difficult. If it started out its life as a Sencha MVC application, it's going to be a bit simpler. So knowing that information is going to be beneficial to our process. The other thing we want to do is we want to look at the quality of the code, see if there are any issues that we're going to need to resolve as part of our upgrade. Are there problems with the application that we need to resolve and that we want to take into account as part of the upgrade process? The first thing we're going to do as part of our upgrade is we're going to create a brand new workspace with Sencha Command. Our application is going to go into that workspace. Now, how many people use Sencha Command as part of their application process? Okay, not everybody. To do the upgrade, using Sencha Command is very helpful. So even if you're not going to use it as part of the process of building your application or your day-to-day development, during the upgrade, it is beneficial. We'll create a new application within the workspace, and into that application, we will move or migrate the pieces of our existing application, reorganizing it along the lines that the new framework expects. Now, Ext JS 4 used the Sencha MVC pattern. That was the recommended best practice. In Ext JS 6, you can still do MVC, but now we have a new pattern, MVVM, Model View View Model. And that's our recommendation. We want to use Model View View Model for our new application. So if our application, our existing Ext JS 4 application is an MVC application, we're going to have to reorganize things to make it MVVM. The other thing we need to do is we need to look at where the functionality of the application is. Is it in the controllers as part of our MVC application? Is some functionality in the views? Is it someplace else in other classes? We want to move the functionality, in most cases, to the new view controllers. Now, if you've got business logic classes, they may move without doing anything special to those classes. They may work as is. But we want to try and make every effort to move functionality out of the views. Our application should be designed with the views being declarative. So we have a define with a config for the view, event listeners, and then the event handlers in the view controller. The next thing we need to do is we need to look at the controllers that make up our original MVC application. Sometimes applications in Ext JS 4 were designed where you had a controller per view. And other times you had controllers that were designed to work across business or functional lines. So they may work with multiple views. In that case, we have to look at the functionality in each of the controllers and decide if we need to create 2 view controllers and split up that functionality. And sometimes that's simple, sometimes it's not. It depends on how much sharing of functionality is done between the event handlers in the controller. Then we want to migrate our event handling. We want to move our selector-based listeners from our controllers to view-based listener configs. And in Ext JS 6, the listeners are simply defined to have the name of the method in the view controller that's going to be executed when that listener fires that event. In Sencha MVC, we had a selector. Now, it's not as easy as searching through your views with a search and replace to find item IDs or X types. Usually the selector is a little more complicated than that. So it does take some effort to find the bits and pieces that you have to assemble the event handling from. And then we're going to move all of our event handling methods to our view controllers from our global controllers. Finally, we want to look at our data stores. Now, largely your models, the structure of models have not changed a lot. There are some differences in things like associations. But essentially, model classes are about the same. So you might be able to use your models as is. Stores, however, we might want to move them. We have an opportunity in migrating from 4 to 6 to move some global stores into the view model. The view model has a stores collection, and we can define our stores within the view model. And the decision on whether to move them from global stores to local to a view is based on the lifetime of that store. If the store is only available with the view and it's bound to the view and it should only exist and be loaded when the view is available, then that's a good candidate for that store to be part of the view model. If the store, however, is shared by multiple views, you may want to leave it as a global store. The other consideration on migrating stores from global to local in a view model is how intensive it is to load that store. Is it resource or time intensive to get the data from the endpoint on the server? If it is, you may want to load the data and keep it around and use it across multiple instances of the view, even if it's only on one view. That way you don't have to reload the store multiple times. We also want to look at some optimizations to our code. And one of the first ones, and probably the most important that's available in Ext JS 6, is two-way data binding. We can get rid of a lot of what I call boilerplate code that loads data into forms and reads data out of forms, stuff that was common in Ext JS 4. In Ext JS 6, we can substitute two-way data binding for that, and all the work is done for us. The other thing we want to look at is how we reference or get instances of components to work with the information, the data, or the component in the application. In Ext JS 6, we have the reference config and the lookup method. This is the preferred way to always access a component. It's the fastest way. It will cache the component reference in a local cache, and if you access it multiple times, you won't have to go find it again. So it's find it once, reuse it many times. So we want to go through the code, and we want to replace our item ID config with references. Now, this is not 100%, you can just do a search and replace all your item IDs. There are a couple places in the framework where item IDs are convenient. For instance, if you have a card layout and you want to set the active item in a card layout, item ID is convenient there for setting the active item. If you want to use a reference in that situation, you have to do the lookup for the reference and pass that to the setActiveItem method. So it depends on efficiency and how easy it is to code that. The other thing we want to do is we want to look at getting rid of the use commonly of up, down, and query in containers. They're no longer needed. And the problem with using up, down, and query is, again, they're based on selectors. They use the component query class. And if you use reference, it will be faster to do a lookup for a reference than it will to use up, down, and query. Now, using ext component query.query to query across views, say for instance you've got a panel that needs to get a reference to a window, or a panel that needs to get a reference to another panel that's not in the same hierarchy, then ext component query is a good way of accessing that still. The other thing we want to look at is, in any case where we've got reusable code in our existing application, we want to look at using packages. Move any code that you can reuse across one or more applications to a Sencha command package. So this is an example of what's common boilerplate code to load form data. In this case, we're getting the field values out of a model, and we're setting the value of the component in the view. So we've got our user profile form. We're using down, which is going to do a component query for an item ID, and we're going to set the value. This is fairly common code in an Ext JS 4 application. And this would be the other side of this, which is taking that data back out after the user has edited it and saving that. This can all be eliminated by using two-way data binding. And here's a short example. We just use the bind config, and we bind to the value of the field in the model that's assigned to our view model. This eliminates all of that boilerplate code to load and save. It's more efficient, but most importantly, it's easier to maintain. There's very little code here to do any work. We let the framework do all of it for us. So now I'm going to jump over to an actual application that I've upgraded. And I want to talk about this application a little bit before we look at it. This application is known as Sencha Fleet. And Sencha Fleet was created a few years ago. The services team used to get together every year and for meetings, talk about customer projects, and we'd have a hackathon. And so Sencha Fleet was one of these hackathon applications. It started out its life as a Sencha Touch 2 application. Later on, we decided we would expand it, and we added a desktop application for dispatching deliveries in the application. So it's really just an example of what you might do in Ext JS 4. And it's been enhanced over time to do a lot of different things. But when I was presented with the opportunity to do this presentation, I thought this would be a good application to do this upgrade. And rather than just focus on the Ext JS 4 desktop part of it, it also has a mobile component. So I wanted to upgrade the whole thing into a universal application. Okay. All right. Okay. I don't know why is that not? All right, I'm going to have to end my slideshow. Because this is not going to. All right. All right, can everybody see that? Okay, scrolling. All right, this is the original Sencha Fleet application. And we can look at the basic structure of it. It has two applications. The Fleet application is the mobile application done in Sencha Touch. And this is the Fleet Dispatcher is the desktop application. And I want to look at this controller here because this shows one of the issues with decomposing the application. If we look at the init method of our MVC controller, we can see that we're dealing with two views here. We've got master deliveries and we've got delivery. And when you look at our views, there's our delivery view and our master deliveries view. So this presents us a problem. We need to break this apart into two view controllers so that we can upgrade this to Ext JS 6 and use MVVM. So in our Ext JS 6 application, we can see here we've created two view classes, the delivery class and the master deliveries class, and they each have their own view controller. If we look at the delivery class, we've gone through and we've replaced our listeners on the view. In the original application, they were done with selectors in the controller, and now we're going to do them with listener configs in the view. And if we look at the view controller, we've got the event handlers within the view controller itself. Now this application is a little tricky. It does present a problem with the stores. And as I mentioned before, a lot of times you want to move the stores from being a global store to a view model store in the stores collection. Now this application also does some interesting things with a cloud implementation. And I'll show you the running application in a minute. But what it's going to do is communicate across the internet with multiple peers. And to do that, each store has to know about the cloud. So if we look at this store, we'll notice bigger. That there's a mix-in applied to this store. Unfortunately, stores on view models are not actual classes. They're simply configs to a store. So this store is not a good candidate for being moved to a view model. It's got to stay a global store because we need to apply that mix-in so that this store will communicate with the cloud. So if we go over to our Ext JS 6 application, you'll see that we've kept the same basic structure of the store. It's still a global store because we need to use that mix-in. Our models are very much the same as they were previously. So if we look at the delivery model, for instance, and then we go over to the Ext JS 6 application, they're very much the same. So we didn't have to do any work there to upgrade the models. The models were very easy to deal with. The other thing we've got some library code in here. We're doing some Google mapping. This application deals with Google Maps. And we've also got our cloud. So in the Ext JS 6 application, I decided that I would move that functionality into packages. So if we look down here, we'll look at the cloud. So all of that functionality has been moved entirely into a package rather than keeping it in the application itself. Now I can reuse it. And also my mapping has been moved into a package as well. So now I have reusable code as part of the upgrade. Now that's not really necessary to do the upgrade, but it is a side benefit of being able to reuse pieces of your application. So the other thing I mentioned, if we look at our views again, let's go to our user profile. All right, this is the user profile form in the old application. And if we look at the controller for our user profile, and ignore the commented out code. We'll see that code that I showed in the slide before. So in this case, we're assigning the values from the model to the fields on the form. And here again is the other code. So we can get rid of all of this really simply in our upgrade by going to our user profile. And using data binding. Now all of that code is gone from our controller. And as a side benefit, saving the data is really easy. All we have to do is call sync on the store. We don't have to get the data back into the store because the data binding is going to do that for us.
What's the subscribe piece?
The
Right at the bottom.
that's, you have to subscribe to the cloud, and I'll show you that in a second, how this application communicates through the cloud. The cloud part is using Socket.io to communicate through two peers. The other thing we get for free when we use data binding is if you look at the down here at the bottom, if we want to reset our form back to the original values, we just call reject on the model. Again, the model, the data is being communicated back to the model through the two-way data binding. If we just want to cancel the changes, we could just do that ourselves. We don't have to reset the values. If we go back to the original application, somewhere. Actually, it's not in the original application. You can't reset it in the original application.
Can you show us what's in the view model for this? Because there must be something to declare what user is. User dot something?
No, there isn't. You're talking about when the user is...
You do the binding user dot something. Where do you, how do you know what the user is?
That's a good question. No, that's not it. That's a good question. And I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't remember where that is exactly. Now, I know the user is coming from local storage.
Should be the other view model? It's in the view model.
No, there's nothing in the view model. That's sort of the beauty of this. It gets picked up in local storage. User profile.
Was
Let's see.
called user in lowercase. So where is that defined?
What's that?
It was called user in lowercase. So where is that defined? In the binding. So it's saying user.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's there's a assignment. That's a good. There we go. Okay, this is where it picks it up. And user profiles, this store is using the user profile model, and the user profile model is using a local storage proxy. So we're going to pick up the user profile from local storage. And so when we pick that up in the callback to the loading of the profile, we're going to assign the profile we found to the user of the view model. Now, this is an important point. When you're dealing with view models, there's two ways to assign data to a view model so that you can use binding. One is set data, the other is set. Never use set data, regardless of, it looks convenient. Don't use it. The reason for it is it's really a sledgehammer approach to wiping out the existing data and replacing it. And all the data that the view model's managing should really be prefixed. So in this case, we're prefixing the user profile model with a user. So in our binding, when we're looking at our user profile view, we've got user.number. And your bind should really be done this way. It makes your code easier to maintain, more descriptive, and more extensible.
So there was no way to assign the user lowercase to the model from within the view model. There was no way to do that. Imperative way, kind of.
Yes, you can. If you want to declare the data as part of the view model, then you can just, and I'll just type it in here. Let me make this bigger. You can just do data. But at this point, you don't have access to the user because we're loading him from the profile. You can't declare him. I could say that I have a default user object. Yeah, I can't type today. Something like that. You can have a default data object. But if I did set data at this point, at some point in the application, I would wipe this data object out. If I did set, and I said, and I did something like set new user. Oops. Okay. and I'm just throwing stuff on the screen now, then that string will be bound to that property new user. And my user data will still exist. So using set gives you a lot more flexibility. All right. So are there any questions on sort of the structure of the application? If we look at the original, which was done with MVC, the application, the cloud functionality, we moved to a package in the Ext JS 6 version. The controllers will become view controllers. This library becomes a package. The models largely will exist as they were before. The stores are going to exist as they did before in this application because of our mix-in. If I didn't have the dependency on that mix-in, then I would probably move them to the view models. And then our views. So that's the basic structure of an Ext JS 4 application. If we go to our Ext JS 6 application, we can see our models still the same. Now, because this is a universal application, my models are under the app folder. This way I can use them in the mobile app and in the desktop app. The stores, because they're global, same thing. I can use them in both places. I have one global, it's not a global controller. My cloud controller, in the original application, we had a global controller for managing the cloud. In the Ext JS 6 application, I moved that to a base class. It's still a view controller, but I'm going to extend that, and I believe, if I look at my main controller, so this is my main view of the application. I've decided that I'm going to use the cloud controller functionality and extend that. So you can see my main controller doesn't extend ext.app.viewController. It extends my cloud controller. And that way I get my interaction with the cloud functionality. Now I could have kept this as a global controller, and there's no harm in having a global controller in an Ext JS 6 application. It still works. One area where it is convenient to do that is routing. If you want to manage routing globally in your Ext JS 6 application, then using a global controller does work. And the reason for that is that if you tie routing to a particular view controller, the view controller must exist for the routing to work. Yes?
Where would you put global functions that you want to leverage throughout your application?
I would create a separate class for that. If it's just functionality, I would use a singleton. Yes?
So after successfully migrating the JavaScript files, how do you migrate the CSS files, CSS files, the themes, etc.?
That's a good question. It depends on how involved. If you've created a custom theme in Ext JS 4, you may or may not be able to move that to Ext JS 6. It depends on what you've done. So you need to review what you've done in Sass, and you may have to recreate a new theme and move your customizations to the new theme. It's largely dependent on what you've done in the prior theme. If it's just CSS, you can move that into the resources folder of the application. There's no problem with doing that.
Well, because the question
No. Unfortunately, no. Now, we do have the themer, which does make theming really, really easy, but it's largely for creating new themes. If you have an existing theme that has a lot of customizations, you're going to have to review what you've done and probably handle that accordingly.
So it sounds like you can use, if you have an existing theme in 4.2, you just modify the styles, then you can easily just port that over to the Ext 600 without modifying your themes.
The theme structure is similar, but there are differences. So again, you'd have to really review what you've done. Oops. So this is the running application, and let me restart it. All right. So in honor of what happened yesterday, I thought it would be good to have two people who should be talking to each other on the list. So this is the application running. This is the Ext JS 6 application. And I mentioned the cloud implementation. So if I click on here, so I sent a hello, and so Donald said hello to Hillary, and Hillary says hi to Donald. And you can see that the mapping also pops up the chat. This is exactly the way it used to work in Ext JS 4, but now it's in Ext JS 6. And there's far less code because I've taken advantage of code reuse with packages, data binding, and moving things to view models and view controllers. But I've got the same exact application as it was before. Any other questions? Yes?
I want to come back to that model thing. I saw you basically going to get the data with your store and then set your view model to look at that data.
Yes.
What if you would want to have two different views that basically look at the same data? So that would be two different view models.
Correct.
You would need to go and set like that?
Correct. So you'd want to get access to the view and get reference to the view model and then set on the view model for that view.
But what if you don't know what views you're actually going to have open there? Whenever you load your data, you don't know what views are going to be open to look at that data. How do you?
You're saying you don't know at any one, but
The user can open different windows that looks at different aspect of the data, but there's only one copy of the data.
correct.
So whenever you get that data and you want to kind of bind with all the different views so that
Correct.
the data gets into all these different views, how do you set all these different view models to look at the same store?
You'd do a set on each view model for each view. You'd have to keep track of the views as they're open. Like, say the user can, and if it's a multi-window application, so they can open a window and some data would be assigned to it.
When the window opens on the initialization of the window, could you go and get that connection with the store from the view perspective?
Yes. Yeah, and then assign the model to it. And if you have the same model assigned to multiple views, if you update it from one place, the user will see it updated in other places as well. So if they start typing in one, all of the other views would see the data updated. So it's always in sync. It's not like it's ever out of sync.
In real time, as you're typing.
Correct. Now, the view models deal with binding asynchronously, but not. It's a little tricky. It's run on a timer. So it acts asynchronously, but it's not technically asynchronous. So it's non-deterministic. You cannot code your application depending on things happening at any particular time. There are ways to force the data binding to update, but it's not a great thing to do in your application. There are some edge cases where you might want to do it, but it's not a recommended best practice.
How long did it take you to do the upgrade?
Well, this application evolved over time, and it took about 3 to 4 weeks, give or take. It was an on again, off again upgrade process. But I had done the desktop application and most of the mobile application, so I was pretty familiar with all the code. So I'm estimating, because it was, being on the services team, if I'm not engaged with a client, then I have free time to do things like prepare presentations for SenchaCon. So it was not a continuous process, but I would say that's about how long this took. And this is not a tiny application. I'm sure a lot of you have really, really big applications out there. This is not a huge application either, but it's a good gauge for how difficult it is. Any other questions? Yes?
When you talk about packages, when you're creating packages, is it possible to create packages that are common between, for example, the classic and the modern toolset?
Yes, it is. And in fact, I have both here. If you look at it, in my packages, and I'll just shrink this down. The SST, and SST stands for Sencha Services Team. The SST Geo is the desktop geolocation library, and the SST GeoM is the mobile version. And the signature is mobile so that they can gather signatures on their mobile device. The cloud is both. So that package works with both the mobile and the desktop, or classic and modern.
Is there a config value you have to set for that to work?
No, it's just a matter of not including things that are only in one of the toolkits. If you include things that are in only one of the toolkits and you try to put it in the other toolkit, it won't work. Yeah, if you look at my app.json, you can see there's a requires under modern for GeoM and signature. And if I can find it, yeah. Actually, the Geo is cross-platform. It's a subset of the mobile. So this, in app.json, these packages are applied to both toolkits, and then you can do a requires down at the bottom in your build profiles that applies only to that build profile. Any other questions? All right, thank you.